Welcome to Grand Prix, your go-to channel for the fastest updates in Formula One. We've got 3 hot stories for you, so make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay ahead of the pack. Let's get started. The afternoon session of preseason testing began at a slower pace, as teams focused on finalizing adjustments before sending their cars out onto the track. During the opening minutes, no drivers took to the circuit, with engineers making last-minute refinements to adapt the cars to each new driver stepping in for the session. Unlike the morning stint, where teams pushed aggressively for early data collection, the afternoon started with a more measured approach. It wasn't until 20 minutes into the session that the first car hit the track, Isaac Hager of Racing Bulls, marking the beginning of the afternoon's on-track action. Almost simultaneously, Haas sent Esteban Ocon out for his official debut with the team, while reigning champion Max Verstappen also made his way onto the circuit, kicking off his first laps of the session. As expected, more drivers gradually followed, getting into their respective testing programs. Half an hour into the session, Brazilian rookie Gabriel Bortolito made his first appearance on the track, but only for a brief installation lap before heading back to the garage for additional adjustments. While his team worked on fine-tuning the car, Ferrari's Charles Leclerc was the most active driver early on, logging multiple laps despite his times being far from those recorded in the morning session. The significant track condition changes between the two sessions, combined with varying fuel loads and tire compounds, contributed to the slower lap times at this stage. Even so, Verstappen quickly found his rhythm, coming close to the best time set earlier in the day. Meanwhile, Pierre Gasly also established a strong pace, delivering a series of consistent quick laps as he continued adjusting to his new car. The first major incident of the session occurred when Racing Bull's Isaac Hager spun off the track after pushing too hard into a corner. Fortunately, he avoided significant damage, although he flat-spotted his tires, requiring an unscheduled pit stop. Around the same time, Williams deployed Carlos Sainz with Flovis paint applied to key aerodynamic surfaces of the car. This brightly colored fluid is commonly used to visually track airflow patterns, helping engineers analyze how the car behaves under various conditions. Meanwhile, Bortolito returned to the track, this time settling into a longer stint, focusing on race simulations rather than outright lap times. After an hour of running, Pierre Gasly was at the top of the timesheets, followed closely by Verstappen in second and Sainz in third. Despite several drivers improving their times, Bortolito had yet to complete a competitive flying lap and was positioned in 19th place. While lap times in testing are not always indicative of a car's actual performance, they provide early hints at each team's approach and the overall balance of their cars. The session was expected to gain intensity in the remaining hours, with teams shifting from data collection to more aggressive performance runs. As the preseason testing session continued, teams gradually increased their activity on the track, with more drivers setting competitive lap times. The early part of the session saw Max Verstappen push harder, attempting to match the best lap of the morning. After a few laps in race trim conditions, the Red Bull driver started improving his pace, inching closer to Andrea Kimi Antonelli's benchmark. Verstappen was not the only one finding speed. Pierre Gasly also ramped up his performance, delivering a string of fast laps as he familiarized himself with his new car. Meanwhile, Racing Bull's Isaac Hager was among the most active drivers on track despite his earlier spin. He continued logging consistent laps, helping his team gather crucial data. However, not everything was running smoothly across the field. Several teams struggled with tire degradation, as the track temperature had risen slightly compared to the morning session, affecting grip levels. Carlos Sainz, driving for Williams, conducted an extended run with medium tires, aiming to assess how the car behaved over longer stints. The team continued using Flovis paint to monitor aerodynamic efficiency, while Bortolito, in the Sauber, also focused on long-run simulations rather than outright speed. As the session progressed, George Russell emerged as a strong contender, executing a well-structured stint that eventually saw him surpass Antonelli's time. The Mercedes driver topped the leaderboard with a fast lap, signaling that his team was beginning to extract more performance from their package. While Verstappen continued his runs, Red Bull seemed more focused on consistency rather than outright speed. The Dutchman delivered multiple laps within a narrow time window, demonstrating the car's stability in race conditions. With 2 hours remaining in the session, the weather forecast began raising concerns, as trackside reports indicated that rain could arrive within the next 30 minutes. The possibility of wet conditions led to increased urgency in the garages, with teams accelerating their testing programs before the rain disrupted proceedings. Despite this, a few teams had not brought sufficient sets of wet weather tires, potentially limiting their running if the conditions worsened. At this stage, Gabriel Bortolito and Lando Norris were the only two drivers yet to complete a flying lap. Both had made brief appearances on track, but returned to the pits after initial assessments. McLaren, like Williams, was also experimenting with Flovis paint, primarily on the rear section of their car, to gather more aerodynamic data. Shortly after, George Russell posted another impressive lap, further solidifying Mercedes' strong showing in the session. His consistency highlighted that the W15 could be a serious contender this season. Meanwhile, Verstappen continued his extended run, maintaining stable lap times but occasionally locking up under braking, a sign that the team still had work to do in fine-tuning the car's balance. One particularly interesting detail spotted during Bortolito's pit stop was the introduction of LED indicators on Sauber's wheel guns. The team had implemented a system where a green light illuminated when the wheel nut was securely fastened, providing an additional safeguard against errors during pit stops. This innovative feature could prove beneficial throughout the season, ensuring quicker and safer tire changes. As the session approached the 2-hour mark, Verstappen began pushing harder, attempting to simulate a qualifying run. However, he struggled with minor oversteer and slow corners, highlighting potential weaknesses in Red Bull's setup. While this was expected given the early stage of testing, it suggested that adjustments would be necessary over the coming days. Near the end of the session, Ferrari's Charles Leclerc set the fastest lap of the day, briefly taking the top spot before Norris completed his first serious attempt at a timed lap and reclaimed first place. The McLaren driver's lap pushed Russell to second, with Verstappen settling in third. Bortolito, despite now having completed multiple runs, remained outside the top 10, focusing on data collection rather than raw speed. With the rain now imminent, teams scrambled to complete final laps before conditions deteriorated. The approaching weather threatened to cut short any remaining qualifying simulations, adding pressure for those who had yet to show their true pace. While not all questions had been answered, the second half of the session revealed more about the pecking order, setting the stage for further developments in the final hours of testing. As the final segment of the afternoon session unfolded, teams increased their pace, with several drivers attempting fast laps before conditions deteriorated. With approximately 1 hour and 55 minutes remaining, an unexpected red flag interrupted the action. A sudden power outage at the circuit caused a failure in trackside lighting, forcing drivers back to the pits while race officials worked to restore visibility. Although the clock continued running, teams had to adjust their plans while waiting for the session to resume. Despite the disruption, engineers took advantage of the downtime to refine setup configurations. After several minutes of uncertainty, the circuit's lighting system was gradually restored, and the FIA confirmed that the session would be extended by an additional hour to compensate for the lost time. As soon as the track reopened with 50 minutes remaining, nearly all drivers returned to the circuit. Gabriel Bortolito and Max Verstappen exited the pits simultaneously, engaging in a brief side-by-side moment during their outlaps as they worked to bring their tires up to optimal temperature. One of the most active drivers in this final stretch was Carlos Sainz, who continued logging laps despite minor off-track excursions. Meanwhile, George Russell of Mercedes remained consistent, completing numerous runs with a visibly low ride height that caused his car to scrape along the track. This sparked speculation that Mercedes might need to adjust their setup to avoid excessive bottoming out during race conditions. With just over an hour to go, the session reached its most intense phase, as multiple teams unleashed their drivers for flying laps. Lando Norris capitalized on the improved track conditions, setting the fastest time of the day and displacing Charles Leclerc from the top of the standings. The Ferrari driver remained competitive, staying within a fraction of Norris' benchmark. Russell held firm in third, while Verstappen continued focusing on high-fuel runs rather than outright speed. Meanwhile, Bortolito had yet to complete a fully competitive flying lap. Although he had accumulated valuable mileage, His lap times remained outside the top 10. However, in the closing stages, he finally switched to a push lap, managing to outpace his teammate Nico Hülkenberg. This marked a small but positive step in his adaptation process, considering the differences in tire compounds used between their fastest runs. As the session entered its final 30 minutes, drivers maintained a high level of activity. Russell continued chipping away at his lap times, inching closer to Norris' best effort. Verstappen, on the other hand, experimented with different braking points and throttle application, suggesting that Red Bull was still fine-tuning balance issues identified earlier. With just 10 minutes remaining, Bortolito returned for one final attempt at a quick lap. He improved his first two sectors, ultimately climbing to 12th place, a considerable jump from his previous position. Despite still being far from the front-runners, the session provided him with much-needed experience in handling the car under various conditions. By the time the checkered flag waved, Lando Norris remained the fastest driver of the day, followed by George Russell in second and Max Verstappen in third. Bortolito wrapped up the session in 12th, while the slowest times belonged to Nico Hülkenberg, 18th, and the two Haas drivers, Esteban Ocon, 19th, and Ollie Behrman, 20th. With the first day of official track action complete, teams will now analyze data collected from their runs, refining their setups for the upcoming days of testing. While it is too early to draw firm conclusions, the session provided an intriguing first glimpse into the competitive landscape of the new season.